Hi guys, welcome to SMSF Mate Podcast today. Before we get started, let me start off with a general advice warning. We are required to warn you that any advice has been prepared without taking into account your objectives, financial situations or needs, and because of that, you should, before acting on the advice, consider the appropriateness of the advice and have regard for your own objectives, financial services and needs. And where the advice relates to an acquisition or possible acquisition of a particular financial product, you should obtain product disclosure statements, or a PDS, relating to the product, and consider the PDS before making any decision about whether you should acquire that product.
All right, welcome everybody to SMSF Mate's podcast. Joined with us today, I've got Ashwin on my left. I've got Tim in the background staring at me through a lens with a thumbs up. And I've also got Bill Savellis from Olive Grove Financial Advice from Sydney on the call and also in the video. So Ashwin voice.
Hi guys, how you going?
And Bill, do you want to make sure you can talk? So they know
they're not
using bots. That's Bill. So today we are going to talk about aged care and navigating the aged care landscape from a super SMSF related point of view, right? So to get us started, Bill, do you want to do a quick little intro?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've been a financial advisor now since early 2000. My background prior to that, I used to work for broking firms, groups like Merrill Lynch and UBS Warburg at the time. I don't know if either one of them now exist. And been practicing since 2000, or around about 2000, been running my own practice from about 2008. And I've been specialising in aged care since about 2016.
Right.
Run my own little practice here in Sydney and got a few staff members that work for my business.
Great, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. All right, so we'll kick off with a question, Ashwin.
Yeah, I suppose how do people navigate aged care when they're in retirement, or what's the common scenario that you sort of see?
The common scenario is usually I receive a panicked phone call from a sibling. Not a sibling, sorry, from a child.
Yep.
A parent has had a fall, or something has happened where the parents might be in hospital or just can no longer look after themselves. And they've got to go straight to aged care, and they've got to go quickly, and they have no idea what to do. That's about 90% of the phone calls I get. So they generally are inbound phone calls of people in a stressful situation, not knowing what to do, and are looking for answers quickly. That's generally the situation that we find. The process that we usually go through is that, or the way that I structure the business is that we generally spend some time getting people to a point where they're at least comfortable, because they are generally stressed and they are generally panicked, and they just need some answers, some really quick questions, and we provide those kind of answers up front so they can at least get settled and feel as if the whole world's not going to come to an end.
So Bill, what are some of the questions you generally get asked then?
I mean, look, the questions they go straight to is, what's going to happen to mum or dad's Centrelink or their age pension?
Right.
That's generally the question number one. Do we have to sell the house?
Right.
Is number two. Can mum afford or dad afford to go to aged care?
Right.
And last on the question, it might be a little bit self-serving, but I understand why people ask it, is what does this mean for our inheritance? And that's usually the last thing that people consider, but nevertheless, it's a consideration.
Yeah. I suppose.
I mean, I got into it because my parents found themselves in this situation.
Yeah, right.
And so I found myself where I had to try to navigate Centrelink, and I had to try to navigate my aged care, and it was a minefield. There were so many different forms, so many different things I had to learn, and some things would contradict other things, and I got confused by it. So I had to learn it really quickly, and so once I went through that, I realised this is an area that definitely financial advisors can provide guidance on, and that's how I got into it, essentially.
Right.
What were the forms or the institutions you had to deal with your parents? What was that experience like?
Well, Centrelink is not one place. There's a lot of divisions within Centrelink. So you've got the Centrelink side of it, which deals with aged care. You've got the Centrelink side of it, which deals with age pension. And you've got the My Aged Care side of it, which will deal with things like the home care packages and getting and getting approvals and funding on that. So there's different divisions within Centrelink. So calling Centrelink is complex in itself. And just to get through to someone on the phone will generally take about 40 minutes to an hour if you can get through it. But then there are times when you might have to call different phone numbers because one division can't handle that inquiry. So you've got to call another division to get an answer to a question, and then maybe come back to the original place you started off to finish off your, what you're trying to do.
So for our listeners of the podcast, is there any sort of tips and tricks as to fast tracking, the information?
Yeah, the fast tracking, if you're an advisor, the fast tracking is to throw yourself in the deep end and know that that you're probably going to stumble your way through initially, because there is no real, there's no real procedure that you can follow, and so you've got to feel your way through it, and eventually you'll get a gut instinct in terms of what the likelihood is, or the way that you need to process it. You can put a broad strategy around it or broad procedure around it. But even if you've got a pretty good procedure in place, there's always little complications that come up along the way, and you've got to try to navigate those issues. So the more you do it, the better you get at it, and it's just a matter of throwing yourself in the deep end and then just giving it a go.
I guess what would be, I know you alluded that 90% of the situations is people calling in a panic or the circumstances happen. What would you do proactively as a member of a fund or a retiree? What would you do proactively so you can navigate this easier for your kids or power of attorneys?
Look, I mean, the first thing I would do is obviously get the will in order. And the will generally states, for most people, that if anything happens to dad, everything goes to mum. And if anything happens to mum, everything goes to dad. And if anything happens to both, it all gets divided up for the kids in equal proportions. Mm-hmm. And that's fine for most of your life. When you're approaching aged care years, your frailty years, as we like to call it, you might want to review that and decide whether you actually want the assets to go to your surviving spouse or whether you want it to go straight to the kids. The reason why you'd want to consider that is because there are some financial benefits in doing so. So, for example, if there is a partner who passes away and all the assets go to their surviving spouse, and then that surviving spouse goes to an aged care facility, their aged care fees will be higher as a result of that.
Because
so you might want to reconsider
like that.
The estate. Yeah, you might want to consider the estate planning side of things, and looking at ways of maybe restructuring it. It's also important to have, I think, family discussions about what's going to happen when the time comes where you might need to go into an aged care facility. I think what happens is it remains an undiscussed topic, and so there's a lot of panic when the time comes that has to take place. I would think having that discussion up front and making some clear decision as to what you're going to do, I think makes a lot more, a lot easier to manage when that time comes. But it just remains an undiscussed topic.
Yeah, and for me personally, I'm probably a bit naive in this, but what sort of fees are you up for an aged care facility?
Now, so let's say, for example, you go into an aged care facility, and the accommodation bond. So there's usually 4 costs associated with aged care. Mm-hmm. So there's the accommodation bond, which on average they're around $550,000.
Right.
The most expensive I've seen is $2 million.
Wow.
The cheapest I've seen is maybe around $200,000, but they tend to be regional areas. Okay.
Yep.
And the way that I explain it to people when you're looking at an accommodation bond, it's like buying a house or renting. Okay. You've got the same kind of concepts that apply with aged care. So you either buy a room, which is around the $550,000 mark, but it can be as much as $2 million, or you can rent it. Right. And similar to buying a house or renting, you can either, when mum or dad pass away, that money gets returned back to their estate if they buy the room. If you rent it, that money goes forever, just like it does in the normal scenario. So you've got that accommodation bond scenario. You've got a basic daily fee, which at the moment is about $21,000. You've got a means tested fee, which can be up to $31,000, up to $31,000 per annum.
Right.
But there's a lifetime cap of about $70,000. So once you hit the $70,000 mark, that ends. So usually what happens is that you pay the maximum, you pay it for 2.5 years, and that disappears. And then you've got additional service fees, which is up to the aged care facility. So you could get to a point where you're paying in the first few years around about $90,000 a year, if not more, $100,000 a year.
Wow, and I assume that's per person.
Per person.
Yeah.
And as interest rates have gone up, the renting component of the accommodation bond becomes more expensive. So the way you work out the rental component is, let's say, for example, the accommodation bond is $500,000. Then the rental equivalent is based on a percentage. Right now, it's 7.9%.
Right.
So 7.9% of 500,000. That's how you work out the rental equivalent.
Right.
So it ends up becoming quite a substantial amount. And we've seen over the last 12 months, as interest rates have gone up, so has that rental component. For lack of use that term because that would be easier for most people to understand. That's gone up quite significantly over the last 12 months.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that is a big cost.
And how does if someone is on an aged care pension, does that cover any of that?
Well, the second option, which is the basic daily fee, which I mentioned was about $21,000.
Yeah.
That's pegged to the full age pension.
Right.
So the full age pension, that fee always is linked to is always 85% of the full age pension.
Right.
So the age pension goes up twice a year in March and September.
Right.
So will the basic daily fee go up twice a year in March and September to stay at 85% of the full age pension.
Right.
So what generally happens if people choose to keep the home, for the first 2 years, the home is excluded as an asset for the age pension. Okay?
Right.
But then after 2 years, what happens is that the individual that goes to an aged care facility is then deemed to be a non-homeowner, and their previous family home is then deemed to be an investment property, so then counts as an asset. And so what would happen is that they lose the age pension after 2 years. So whereas you're paying a certain amount and some of it's being subsidised by the age pension, if you choose to keep the house after 2 years, you lose the age pension, so your costs go up essentially. Because you lose the income that you were otherwise relying on to help cover some of that cost.
And is that why you alluded to the estate planning around the house leaving after someone passes? So that you wouldn't be faced with that 2 year situation, because obviously you could sell your house in 2 years, but that cash is now an asset for an assets test as well. So
correct. I think for most people, not the case with all clients, but with most people, the home is their biggest asset, and especially in Sydney, where houses are upwards of $1 million, closer to $2 million, and these are people that are not necessarily rich. They just bought at a time where houses were more affordable, and that house has grown to a much more significant value. The biggest asset is their family home, and if they don't manage their financial situation well, they might be in a situation where they're forced to sell their home. They've now got a lot of cash sitting in the bank, and they're paying the maximum fees for aged care.
Yeah.
So for what I would say, it's important to have that family discussion. I mean, I would get a call, I get calls from people who are, looking to plan for these things in advance. And the first step is really, what I propose always is to have family discussion first. Bring all stakeholders into the conversation. It's not just a conversation for mum and dad. It's a conversation for all, because everyone could be impacted by these decisions that are made. So I like to get the whole family involved in these discussions, and to get and obviously have conversations with mum and dad on their own if they have capacity to have these discussions, because I want to also make sure I get with their view on how they want things done without the influence of their kids. But I do stress that all kids the kids be part of the whole process, because I think it's important. It's funny too that unfortunately I've had to deal with a few situations where you've got people with a few hidden agendas. And so the reason why you want the whole family there is, what you don't want is someone trying to angle that they can get a majority of the estate. So I try to get the whole family involved to avoid that kind of complication.
Yeah, and I think conversations are the best way to clear a lot of situations out, and things can be moved forward from that point of view, I suppose, especially if an advisor's present to sort of guide the conversation on what the outcomes or positives are. And I think that's
exactly.
Really
and you'd be surprised if some people got some radical ideas And, you just got to say, well, that's fine. You can think that, you can have that idea, but these are the consequences of going down that path. And so it does have that advisor role I think is quite important at that stage, because there is such little knowledge around it. And people just really come up with these really wild ideas at sometimes. And so having that advisor tell them what the consequences are, I think, is beneficial for all to hear.
Agreed, yeah.
I think of quite a prominent strategy, well, not a prominent, because I tend to steer away from this, but granny flat provisions is an area where, you've got to be really careful as an advisor. There's a lot of risk involved with that. It is something that you can consider and is appropriate for some people, but it's also a very dangerous strategy, and if used incorrectly, can really leave some people out of the estate completely. And so the granny flat provision is something you've got to be careful about, but it's something that you could consider as potential strategy at that stage of life.
Would you like to expand on that granny flat strategy?
So what a granny flat strategy is where mum or dad, say mum, decides to transfer the house out of her name and transfers it to a child. And that child, in exchange of that transfer, that child will care for their parent for as long as they can. Doesn't stop them from going to aged care at some point, but they give almost like an assurance that they will care for mum and dad in their frail years. And they can do that without it impacting their age pension entitlements. Now, the danger to that is that it transfers to one child, and if that ends up being their primary asset, other children may be left out of, because there's nothing left in the estate. So even if the will says all assets are to be distributed equally, there are no assets to distribute. The other disadvantage is for the parent. Once they transfer the property, that's it. They lose ownership. They don't own that property anymore. And so there is a risk for them that if the child doesn't honour their agreement, that they are essentially at risk of having no money. There are ways of trying to reverse it, but they can be complex and can be costly. And so it's just better not to get yourself in that situation.
And you can't really transfer half of a house asset either, can you? It's all or nothing.
Well, you can transfer half, but then that would be that wouldn't fall under a granny flat arrangement. That would be more like just a gifting arrangement, in which case it does have an impact on your age pension.
Understood. And does that so would there be stamp duty and capital gains concessions in there?
Well, well. If you're transferring the family home, there wouldn't be any capital gains implications because there's no CGT on the home, but there would be stamp duty factors that you need to consider.
Yeah.
So like I said, it's a really complex area. And it's an area where, again, unless I'm absolutely confident that parents have capacity, that every other family member is aware of what's going on, that this works. It's not just about getting assets out of someone's name, but it's actually in the interest of mum and dad. Then it's something I tend to steer away from. But obviously these are things that you can consider.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, I think like you said, you got to take all the factors in and all people involved to make an actual plan around it, opposed to just trying to tunnel vision to maybe get one result that actually has a complication further down the line, which happens in tax and advice.
And you're right about it's kind of a conversation that no one really wants to have until it's a bit too late in the timeline.
Yeah, I mean, you'd be surprised how many people as well just don't have the powers of attorney in place when mum and dad need to have lost capacity, and that in itself can be very stressful trying to go through the process of getting a financial management order. So just getting those right documents in place, I think is a pretty important, pretty important step.
Speak for yourself, Gareth. I've got mine all in order.
Yeah. You're an accountant. You're supposed to have your stuff in order.
And I have a third kid, so definitely on my cards.
And maybe, Bill, you could expand on how this all applies with people who potentially live overseas. Mum and dad live in Sydney, and the kids live overseas. How does that all implode? Was the word I was going to use.
Well, look, I mean, I have had. Fortunately, I've had in a situation where all the kids are abroad.
Right.
I have had situations where some kids are abroad, but the powers of attorney allow them to act severally as well as jointly.
Okay.
So, but what, I mean, as an advisor, I tend to do a lot of my meetings online. And it's for this reason where you've got kids who either are abroad or maybe living in completely different locations. So as an advisor, we tend to have a lot of online meetings so that all the appropriate parties are part of the meeting. So it does complicate things when they're overseas, because if you're trying to organise that, I mean, I'd say to people, look, don't worry about the financial advice, I'll deal with it, because you're going to need to worry about clearing out the house if mum is, the last remaining parent. You've got to clear out the house. You've got to organise whether to rent or sell it. You've got to then make sure that you're keeping the real estate agent honest if you are selling, or make sure you've got the right kind of tenants in there.
Yeah.
You've got to make sure mum and dad settle into the home care, to the aged care facility. You've got to make sure they ease in, so you need to be there for them. So there's a lot of steps that they've got to go through. Dealing with what the strategy is, I think, is just one of those things that they'd like to get to, but they just don't have the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just the fact of cleaning out the house, I mean, it can be a costly exercise. And if someone's lived in their home for 20, 30 years, they've accumulated a lot of junk. And so they've got to spend some time just clearing it all out and getting it ready for
life treasures, I think they call those.
What are the different stages people go through in retirement, and when should they consider an aged care practices for themselves?
We consider retirement to be broken into 3 stages. You've got your early years of retirement, which is where you're probably spending most of your money on lifestyle and discretionary spending.
Yep.
You've got your slower years where you're not as mobile as you once were. You probably need some support around the house, and that's where generally home care packages come into use. And then you've got your frailty years where you're no longer able to look after yourself. You're probably needing a great need of support, maybe looking to consider an aged care facility.
So just to touch base, what are those home care packages that in between before aged care? What exactly are those?
So the government would prefer that you stay home rather than go to an aged care facility. It's a lot cheaper for governments to provide a home care package. It's funding that individuals receive above and beyond the age pension. And the home care packages are broken up into 4 levels. You've got level 1, where you need the least amount of support, and level 4, which is considered high care. And the funding can go up as high as $60,000, $65,000, $70,000. And that doesn't mean that money gets given per year.
Per year.
And that doesn't mean that goes to the individual and they can spend it however it likes. It goes through a home care provider, and they take their chunk of that money for providing all the administrative support. But you can use that money to help cover costs like a cleaner for the house, someone to come and provide you, cook for your meals or bring you meals, someone who can help you go shopping, someone who can do the gardening. It's there to cover those kind of costs, because you can no longer do those things for yourself, so you can hire that out to someone else. You can also pay for social support or nurses or someone to come and help you with your medication. It's there to cover those kind of costs. It doesn't have to be service-based either. It can also be purchasing of equipment. So if you need to buy, a hospital bed, then you can use that funding to help cover that cost if that's what you need in your home.
And Bill, is there an approval process? I would imagine is there some complicated paperwork? Does someone come and?
There is. Yeah. They don't give it to you too easily. The first step is you've got to apply for an ACAT assessment. An ACAT, I can't off the top of my head, I can't remember what it is, but what it stands for. But an ACAT assessment. It's called ACAS in Melbourne. And what an ACAT assessment is where a registered nurse comes to your home and they assess just how much support you need.
Right.
And they get access to medical records, so they're not there to assess necessarily your medical background, but they tend to ask questions around what kind of difficulty do you have around the house. The unfortunate thing is a lot of elderly, what they tend to do is give very positive answers. Yeah, I'm doing great. I'm wonderful. Would you like a cup of tea? And so it's good to have family members with them just to say, look, in reality, they're struggling to walk around the house. They're a full risk. They can't cook. They can't do the gardening.
Yeah.
It's that type of responses you need to provide. And based on that, they will then give you an approval on what level, if you get approved, whether you're a level 1 or 2 or 3 or 4.
Right.
Once you get that, you've got to find a home care provider who then they've got a spot available, will then start to support you. They'll get the funding for it, and then they'll start to work out a plan on how you go about allocating those funds.
Right. So it's sort of managed by a third party, is what you're saying?
It can be. It can be self-managed also, which is a cheaper option. The cost for having it managed by a professional team means that the cost could be around 30-40% of the funding that you receive. Mm-hmm. So it can be quite pricey, but there is value with having someone who's managing it for you rather than trying to self-manage it.
Right.
It's cheaper to self-manage, but there's a lot more work involved, and generally the person who's receiving the care isn't up to that task. Yeah. So it's better to outsource to someone else.
Yeah,
understood. So, Bill, what should people sort of consider if they're looking at an aged care facility? You know, what are some of the rap sheet points?
Well, there's a good online website you can go to, My Aged Care website, where you can start looking at facilities. The first thing I would look at is their ratings, so how have they been rated from an auditing point of view.
Right.
And I'd be looking at their costs. There's a lot of facilities out there who still charge no additional service fee, and there are others out there that have now started to charge that additional service. That adds to the cost of aged care.
Yeah.
So the additional service fee used to be whereby you paid a little bit extra. Usually it was around $5-10 a day, and you might get a red wine with your meal. You might get a menu of meals rather than a standard meal for the day. They've now become mandatory, obviously because aged care facilities are trying to remain profitable, but there's still plenty out there that don't charge that fee at all. So it's good to go and meet with them. I would say go meet with an aged care facility, get a feel for the facility, and obviously get an understanding of what the pricing is to determine whether it's something that can be afforded by the parents.
And I would imagine, is it fairly difficult and it's expensive to move between facilities? You know, you sort of want to pick the right one.
Yeah, you want to avoid it, not just from a financial perspective, but more from the fact that it disrupts the elderly that go into an aged care facility. As you would imagine, the feedback I get from a lot of clients is that they find it quite upsetting. They're in unfamiliar surroundings, and it takes them a while to settle in. So removing them from one location to another, it could be quite disrupting for them. From a financial perspective, it depends on which way interest rates are going. So we've seen interest rates go up. So if you got them in a year ago, whereby the DAP, which is the rent component of the accommodation bond, the interest rates were a lot lower. So if you're paying a DAP a year ago, moving them to another location will mean that you would get that reassessed.
Right.
And that means that cost could go up. So you'd like to avoid that if you can.
All right, Bill, that was really informative. Thanks very much for joining us on the SMSF Mate podcast today. Any closing remarks?
Yeah, I would say that, look, this is a really exciting area of financial advice. It's definitely a specialist area, and I'm finding that financial advice is becoming more of there are certain specialist fields, like, for example, SMSF is definitely a specialist area. It's not an area that I focus on. So, and I'd leave that to the specialists. I think the same applies to aged care. Yeah. It's become quite a specialist area. I do think there's going to be a lot of change over the next few years around how aged care fees are assessed. And so I think that it will only become more complicated as the population continues to age. If anyone's interested in having a chat with me about it, they can feel more than comfortable giving me a call. My website is olivegrovefinancial.com.au. We can send an email through to team@olivegrovefinancial.com.au.
All right, great.
Thanks a lot, Bill.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for joining us once again. If you're interested in our waffle about self-managed super funds, feel free to join us on smsfmate.com.au or search SMSF Mate in Spotify.